Sir, you need to stop right now. I cannot let you approach the monument.
The morning they dedicated the memorial at Fort Crestlin, the sky came in low and grey, the kind of overcast that doesn't threaten rain so much as it simply removes the option of brightness, leaving everything in a flat, serious light that felt, to the people who noticed such things, entirely appropriate. Folding chairs had been arranged in precise rows on the parade ground, a temporary stage erected with a podium and microphone, red and white bunting along the front rail snapping in the intermittent wind. The memorial itself, a dark granite monument bearing the names of 41 men, stood behind a curtain of a white fabric to the left of the stage, waiting. A crowd of several hundred people had gathered or was gathering. Families, active duty personnel in dress uniform, local officials, veterans organisation members in their caps and blazers, journalists with cameras positioned on tripods along the perimeter. It was the kind of event that had been planned for 2 years and was now, finally, the thing it had been planned to be. If you have ever watched a man be turned away from the place he had every right to stand, comment the word honour below. Because what happened at Fort Crestline that morning, what one security guard almost prevented, and what a 3-star general made right in front of several hundred people, is a story that will stay with you for a long time. His name was Walter Creed. He was 81 years old, and he had driven 4 hours that morning in a 2003 Chevrolet pickup with a cracked dashboard and 212,000 miles on it, because it was the only truck he had, and because 4 hours is not a long drive when the destination has been occupying your mind for the better part of 60 years. He was wearing dark slacks, a white button-down shirt, and a navy blazer that had been purchased sometime in the mid-90s, and still fit him well enough because he had not changed the way some men change, had stayed lean and upright, had not surrendered his posture to the decades in the way that age often insists upon. There were no medals on his blazer, no insignia of any kind. He looked, to anyone who glanced at him without looking, like a retired schoolteacher or a former accountant, a man of modest presentation attending a public ceremony, out of respect for something he had probably read about in the newspaper. He parked at the far edge of the designated lot and walked to the ceremony grounds with the unhurried pace of a man who has arrived early, because arriving early was trained into him so deeply that it stopped being a choice and became simply the way things are done. He had arrived 40 minutes before the scheduled start. The ceremony ground was still being organised. Event staff with clipboards moving between the rows of chairs, a sound technician checking the podium microphone, caterers arranging a reception table near the far tent. Walter walked toward the memorial, toward the covered granite monument that he could see from 30 yards away, the white curtain moving in the wind. The security guard's name was Brandon Kowalski. He was 23 years old, hired by the private events company contracted to handle logistics and crowd management for the ceremony. He was not military, had no military background, and had been briefed that morning for approximately 15 minutes on the event parameters, the restricted zone immediately around the stage and monument, the VIP credentialing process, the perimeter boundaries. He was doing his job. It is important to say that clearly, because what followed was not the story of a malicious young man, but of a young man with incomplete information and the uncalibrated certainty that sometimes fills the space where experience should be. He was stationed at the rope line that marked the restricted zone around the monument, and when he saw an elderly man in a navy blazer walking directly toward the monument, without stopping at the credentialing table, he moved to intercept. "Sir," Brandon said, stepping into Walter's path with the practiced physical placement of someone who has been told where to stand. "This area is restricted to invited personnel and credentialed attendees only. I need to ask you to stay behind the perimeter." Walter stopped. He looked at the rope line and then at Brandon and then at the monument behind its white curtain. He did not appear agitated. He did not appear particularly surprised exactly, though something moved briefly through his expression, a flicker of something that might have been weariness, or might have been recognition, the expression of a man to whom this sort of thing is not entirely unexpected. "I'm here for the ceremony," Walter said. His voice was quiet and even, not appeasing, not confrontational, simply a statement of what was true. "Yes, sir, a lot of people are," Brandon said with the patient firmness of someone who's been told they may encounter pushback and has prepared a tone for it. "But the area immediately around the monument is restricted to credentialed invitees and official participants. Do you have your credential packet?" Walter reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and produced a folded letter. He handed it to Brandon, who unfolded it, scanned it, quickly, the way people scan documents when they are looking for a specific shape of information rather than reading, and frowned slightly. The letter was an invitation, signed by the Fort Crestline Memorial Committee. But it was not the colour-coded, credentialed badge that Brandon's briefing had told him to look for, the laminated tag that indicated verified VIP status. It was just a letter, paper. "Sir, I understand you received an invitation," Brandon said, handing the letter back. "But without the credentialing badge, I can't let you into the restricted zone. You can attend the ceremony from the general seating area. There are excellent seats available in the front rows." Walter took the letter back. He folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. He looked at the monument again, at the white curtain, at the granite edge visible below where the fabric ended, at the names he knew were on that stone, had known before they were carved on it, had carried in a different registry for 6 decades. He nodded once. "All right," he said. He turned and walked to the perimeter. Not to the general seating, not yet, but to the rope line itself, the nearest point he was permitted to be to the monument, and he stood there. Just stood. Not with his hands in his pockets, not shifting from foot to foot the way people stand when they are waiting impatiently. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on the white curtain, in the posture of a man who has stood at attention so many times that his body remembers it even now, even in civilian clothes, even 81 years old with aching knees and a 4-hour drive still in his muscles. He stood the way soldiers stand when they are waiting for something significant, and he was entirely still. Some of the people in the filling chairs noticed him. The woman in the second row who had lost her grandfather in Korea, and who attended every military memorial she could find within driving distance, noticed him, and watched him for a moment before the program sheet in her lap pulled her attention back. The retired Master Sergeant in the Veterans Organisation blazer 3 seats away noticed the posture, and made a mental note that resolved into nothing particular. An event photographer moving along the perimeter raised her camera and took a picture of him. The old man at the rope line, still, hands clasped, eyes on the curtain, without knowing why, following the photographer's instinct that sometimes registers significance before the conscious mind has explained it. Brandon Kowalski went back to his position and watched the crowd continue to fill in, occasionally checking credentials at the VIP entrance, managing the flow of people with the efficiency of someone taking his first real professional assignment seriously. He was not thinking about the old man in the navy blazer. He had handled the situation correctly by the parameters he'd been given. He moved on. The convoy of vehicles arrived at 11:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled start. 3 black SUVs in sequence, preceded by a military police vehicle, moving along the access road at the deliberate pace of official transportation. The crowd oriented toward the vehicles the way crowds orient toward points of arrival, the particular human attention that authority and ceremony command. Event staff moved to the VIP entrance. The Master of Ceremonies took a position near the stage steps. The receiving line formed, local officials, the Memorial Committee chairperson, the Fort Crestline commanding officer in his dress uniform, all of them arranging themselves in the specific configuration that formal occasions require. Lieutenant General Harold Marsh stepped out of the second vehicle. 63 years old, 3 silver stars on his shoulder, combat infantry badge above his ribbons, a face that had the particular quality of senior military leadership. Not hard, exactly, but settled. The expression of someone who made significant decisions regularly and had made peace with the weight of that. He was the keynote speaker for the ceremony. He had requested this assignment personally, through channels that raised some eyebrows at the protocol level, because requesting specific speaking engagements was unusual for a flag officer. But the request had been granted because the reason behind it was known to the people who needed to know it, and it was a reason that did not lend itself to bureaucratic dispute. General Marsh had served as a young lieutenant under the command of the unit, whose memorial was being dedicated today. He had not been present at the engagement that took 41 lives. He had been elsewhere that day, a different assignment, a different sector, the particular randomness of combat deployment that means the difference between being at the place where something terrible happens and being somewhere else entirely. He had lived his entire subsequent career with the awareness of that randomness, with the knowledge that 41 men had died on a day that he had survived not through any quality of his own, but through the arbitrary geography of orders. And there was one other thing he carried, one other piece of knowledge that had informed every year of his career, every citation he had signed, every ceremony he had attended in the half-century since that engagement. He knew that the unit had not been entirely lost. He stepped out of the vehicle and moved toward the receiving line, and he did the thing that receiving lines are designed to receive, began the sequence of handshakes and greetings, the brief exchanges of acknowledgement that formal occasions require, and then he stopped. He had been scanning the grounds in the way that people with military training scan grounds, not with obvious attention, but with the peripheral awareness that processes large amounts of spatial information without appearing to do so. And something in the periphery had resolved into a specific signal that stopped the handshake sequence entirely. At the rope line, 30 yards away, an old man in a navy blazer was standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the covered monument. General Marsh said something brief and quiet to the aide at his elbow. Then he walked away from the receiving line, not toward the stage, not toward the podium. Across the parade ground, directly toward the rope line, toward the old man who had not moved, who had not seen the convoy arrive because his eyes were on the monument and had been on the monument for the better part of an hour. The receiving line did not know what to do with this, and so it did nothing, which was the correct response. The crowd, which had been orienting toward the VIP arrival, reoriented. The event photographer raised her camera. Brandon Kowalski, from his position, watched a 3-star general cross the parade ground, with the direct purposefulness of a man who knows exactly where he is going, and felt something he would later describe as his stomach doing a particular thing it had not done before. Walter Creed heard the change in the crowd before he saw its cause, a shift in the quality of the ambient attention around him, the way a room changes when something significant enters it. He turned from the monument, and he saw General Harold Marsh coming toward him across the parade ground, and something happened in Walter's face that the photographer, who caught it, would say afterward was the most real expression she had photographed in 15 years of event work. It was not surprise, exactly. It was deeper than surprise and older. The expression of a man encountering something he had perhaps stopped permitting himself to expect. General Marsh reached the rope line and stopped in front of Walter Creed. He looked at him for a moment, at the navy blazer, at the white shirt, at the 81-year-old face of the last surviving member of the 41st Infantry's 2nd Platoon, Baker Company, and then he did something that nobody in the crowd, and certainly not Brandon Kowalski, had anticipated. He stepped past the rope, into the restricted zone, crossed the remaining distance between them, and embraced him. Not the formal handshake of an official occasion, not the brief, appropriate contact of protocol. He embraced Walter Creed the way men embrace when they share something that has no adequate language, when the occasion is not ceremony, but something older and more necessary than ceremony. One hand on Walter's back, the other gripping his shoulder, his head bowed slightly, and Walter's hands, which had been clasped behind his back for the better part of an hour, coming up now to complete the embrace, his right hand gripping the general's arm, his eyes closed. The crowd was entirely silent. They stood like that for several seconds, long enough that people who would later describe the moment would struggle with the question of how long it actually was, because it had the quality of duration that significant moments sometimes have, stretching in perception even as it compresses in memory. Then General Marsh stepped back, both hands on Walter's shoulders, and looked at him. "Walter," he said. His voice was not loud, but the microphone on the podium, which was live and had been left open, carried it across the silent parade ground with perfect clarity. "I'm sorry it took this long to get you here." Walter looked at him. His jaw moved once, tightening, and then he nodded with the controlled composure of a man who has long practice at managing emotion in situations that warrant it. "I'm here," he said. General Marsh turned, still with one hand on Walter's shoulder, to face the event staff and the waiting ceremony. He found the Memorial Committee chairperson, a woman named Patricia Downing, with his eyes. "This man cuts the ribbon," he said, not as a request, as an establishment of fact. Patricia Downing, who had organised this event for 2 years and had a programme schedule printed and distributed, and a sequence of ceremonial steps planned to the minute, looked at the 3-star general and at the old man beside him, and said, without any hesitation, "Yes, General, of course." Brandon Kowalski was standing 10 feet away. He had not moved since General Marsh had crossed the parade ground. He was now engaged in the rapid and uncomfortable process of reconstructing a context that he had previously thought he understood. The old man in the navy blazer, the letter of invitation that he had not looked at closely enough, the credential badge he had insisted upon. The man who had said all right and walked to the rope line and stood there for 40 minutes without complaint, hands clasped behind his back, eyes on the curtain. He was reviewing all of this with the particular quality of attention we apply to things we wish we had applied that attention to earlier, and the experience was not comfortable. The aide who had accompanied General Marsh from the receiving line appeared at Brandon's elbow. The aide was a young captain, 29 years old, with the practiced smoothness of someone whose job involves managing the logistics of a flag officer's daily reality. He spoke quietly and without particular emphasis, which made what he said more rather than less effective. "That man served in the unit this memorial honours," the captain said. "He is the only living member of that unit. He was there that day." He paused for one beat. "General Marsh has known him for 50 years. Brandon looked at Walter Creed, who was walking beside General Marsh toward the stage now. Across the parade ground he had walked to the perimeter of an hour ago, through the restricted zone that was not, and had never been, restricted to him. He watched the old man walk, and he watched the general walk beside him, the 3 stars on Marsh's shoulder catching the flat grey light, and he understood, with the specific and unglamorous clarity that arrives when an error reveals itself fully, what had happened, and what he had very nearly been responsible for preventing. General Marsh guided Walter to the front row of seats, not the stage, not yet, but the front row where family members of the fallen had been seated, where there was a reserved chair that had always been intended for Walter Creed, and that the memorial committee had placed there as a matter of established fact 2 years ago, when the event was first being designed. Walter sat. General Marsh said something to him quietly before moving to the stage, and Walter nodded again, and the general climbed the stage steps and took his position at the podium. The ceremony proceeded. There were remarks from the Fort Crestlin commanding officer. There were remarks from a state senator who had worked to secure the funding for the memorial. There was a rendering of taps by a bugler from the bass band, the notes falling into the grey morning air with the particular weight that taps has always carried, the weight that does not diminish with repetition because it was designed not for any specific moment but for all of them, the accumulated meaning of every occasion on which it has been played pressing into the current one. People in the crowd were crying. The woman in the second row who attended every military memorial she could find had her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes closed. And then General Marsh spoke. He spoke for 22 minutes. He spoke about the 2nd Platoon of Baker Company, 41st Infantry, and what they had been asked to do on the 23rd of August 1967, in a province in Vietnam that most of the people in those chairs could not have placed on a map with certainty. He spoke about the nature of the order they had received and the terrain they had entered, and what the Army's official records documented about what happened in the hours that followed. He spoke about 41 men, and he said each of their names, all 41, slowly, with the particular quality of attention you give to names when you're not reciting them but acknowledging them, the difference between a list and a memorial. He spoke about the investigation that had followed, about the citations that had been awarded, about the families that had waited for information and received it in the particular incomplete form that war's paperwork always produces, accurate in the facts it contains and inadequate to the reality it attempts to describe. And then he said, "There is a man in the front row today whose name is Walter Creed. He was a staff sergeant in the 2nd Platoon of Baker Company. He was 26 years old on August 23rd, 1967. He received wounds in that engagement that required 11 hours of surgery and 63 days of subsequent hospitalization. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, and the Combat Infantryman Badge with Star. He is the reason we know with the specificity and accuracy we do know what happened on that day, because his testimony, delivered from a hospital bed, before he had fully recovered, because he insisted on giving it before his memory could soften any of the edges, is the primary first-person account in the official record." He paused. "Walter Creed was the only member of that platoon to come home, and today he will unveil the memorial to the 41 men who did not." The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that a crowd produces only when something has moved through it, with sufficient force to suspend ordinary behaviour, the coughing, the shifting, the small private adjustments that people make during extended public events. It was absolute, and it lasted for several seconds, and it was broken by the sound of applause that began in the front rows and spread backward through the assembled hundreds with the speed and completeness of something that was never in question. Walter Creed stood. He stood the way he had stood at the rope line, straight, deliberate, with the posture that was not performance but simply the residue of a lifetime of meaning it. He walked to the stage steps and General Marsh came down to meet him, and walked back up with him, one step behind and to the left, in the position of escort, and the two men crossed the stage together. Patricia Downing met them at the far side of the stage with the ceremonial scissors, large, silver-handled, the kind used at dedications, and she presented them to Walter with both hands, which was the correct way to present something to a person you were honouring, and she stepped back. Walter Creed stood before the white curtain. He stood there for a moment before he cut it, long enough that people understood he was not pausing, because he had forgotten what came next, or because age had introduced some hesitation, but because he was marking the moment, the way a man marks a moment when he has waited a long time for it, and will not rush through it now that it has arrived. He looked at the curtain. He looked at the shape of the granite behind it. He thought, and this is what several people said afterward, separately without having spoken to each other about it, who watched his face in that moment. He appeared to be speaking, very quietly, with his lips barely moving, a private word to someone who was not visible, which is the thing that people sometimes do in the presence of memorials when they are the people for whom the memorial was made. Then he cut the ribbon. The white curtain fell away from the monument in a single motion, the fabric dropping to the ground cleanly, and the granite memorial stood in the grey morning light with the 41 names cut into its face in the clean, permanent way of letters that are meant to outlast the people who caused them to be written. The crowd responded with sound, applause, some of it ragged with emotion, some of the veterans in the rows standing, the sound filling the parade ground and going out across the base and into the flat grey morning. Walter stood in front of the monument with the scissors still in his hand, and he looked at the names, and whatever passed through him in that moment was his, the private inheritance of a man who knew all 41 of the names that were now cut in stone because he had known all 41 of the men before they became names. He stood there for as long as he needed to, which is the only correct measure of time in such moments, and General Marsh stood 2 steps behind him and to the left, where he had been, and did not move or speak or hurry anything. Brandon Kowalski had been repositioned by the event management team during the ceremony to a different section of the perimeter, which was both a practical decision and, he understood, something more than a practical decision. He stood at his new position, and he watched Walter Creed at the monument, and he felt the full dimension of what he had done and nearly done that morning, in a way that was more thorough and more lasting than any formal reprimand could have achieved, because it was self-administered, which is always the most complete form. He had looked at an old man in civilian clothes with a letter instead of a laminated badge, and he had seen what he was trained to see, an unauthorized presence in a restricted zone, without seeing what was actually there, the sole survivor of the 41 men in whose honor several hundred people had driven and flown from multiple states to stand in a grey morning on a parade ground. The man most central to the entire event, who had driven 4 hours in a truck with 200,000 miles on it, because he was the last one, because there was nobody else to drive it, had arrived 40 minutes early and been turned away from the thing that had been created, at least in part, because of what he had survived and what he had testified to and what he had carried for 60 years. He had said all right and walked to the perimeter and stood there. He had not argued. He had not identified himself. He had waited at the rope line with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on the curtain. Brandon had turned this over in his mind throughout the ceremony and would continue to turn it over in the days that followed. And the question it kept presenting was not why the old man hadn't argued. He understood that, in the way you understand something about a person's character when you have watched them conduct themselves across the course of a few hours, but what it meant that he hadn't needed to. That the integrity of his presence had been sufficient, independent of any credential or badge or laminated permission. That he had simply been who he was, as he had always simply been who he was, and that this had ultimately been recognized and honored. And that the instrument of that recognition had been a 3-star general who had walked away from a receiving line without hesitation, because some things are more important than receiving lines. After the ceremony, in the reception period that followed, Brandon made his way through the crowd to where Walter Creed was standing near the monument, with a paper cup of coffee, speaking with a family whose father's name was on the stone. He waited until the conversation concluded. Walter looked at him when he approached, and his expression was not cold and it was not warm. It was simply open in the way of a man who is neither anticipating trouble nor manufacturing welcome, but simply present. "Sergeant Creed," Brandon said. He used the rank deliberately because he had asked someone what it was, and because he felt it mattered to use it. I owe you an apology. I should have looked more carefully at your letter this morning. I should have asked more questions before I sent you to the perimeter. Walter looked at him. He took a sip of his coffee. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet, not building to something, not performing consideration, but actually considering. You were doing your job, he said, with the information you had. I didn't look for more information, Brandon said. That was on me. It was, Walter agreed. Not harshly, simply accurately. But you're standing here now. That matters. He held out his hand, and Brandon took it. The grip was stronger than he had expected, which perhaps he should also have expected. Next time someone shows up without the right badge, take a minute. Ask them why they're there. You might be surprised what you find. Yes, sir, Brandon said, and meant it as fully as he had ever meant anything. The reception continued around them, the crowd moving between the monument and the refreshment tent, the base photographer documenting the afternoon with the systematic thoroughness of official record-keeping. General Marsh moved through the reception with the unhurried attention of a man who has no intention of being anywhere else, stopping at each cluster of memorial family members with the full weight of his presence, which is the thing that senior officers who understand their role can offer, not simply rank but attention, the signal that what you have lost and what you carry is seen and acknowledged by the institution that sent your person into the thing that ended them. He found Walter again near the monument, standing alone for a moment in front of the granite, reading the names he did not need to read because he knew them all, the same way you read a letter from someone you know, not for information but for contact. Marsh stood beside him. I should have come sooner, Marsh said. You came today, Walter said, and you got the order of the day right. That's what you were trained to do. He glanced sideways at the general with something that was not quite a smile but was in that direction. Command and control, General. You always were better at it than the paperwork. Marsh made a sound that was, from a 3-star general, a remarkably human laugh. They stood together in front of the monument for another moment. 2 old men, one with 3 stars and a motorcade, one with a cracked dashboard truck in the parking lot. In front of the names of 41 others, and the grey morning light sat on the granite, and the letters of the names and on the 2 men equally, the way light falls on things without distinguishing between them. The photograph that ran in the following morning's paper, and in several national publications that picked it up over the next 48 hours, was taken by the event photographer who had watched Walter stand at the rope line an hour before the ceremony. She had photographed the embrace on the parade ground. She had photographed Walter cutting the ribbon. She had been moving through the reception crowd when she turned and saw the 2 men standing together in front of the monument, their backs to the camera, both of them looking at the names, and she stopped and raised her camera and took the picture, and knew, in the way that photographers know certain images before they have developed them, that this was the photograph. It ran under a caption that said simply, General Harold Marsh, retired, and Staff Sergeant Walter Creed, retired, at the dedication of the Baker Company 2nd Platoon Memorial, Fort Crestline, and in smaller text beneath, Sergeant Creed is the sole surviving member of the unit. In the days after the ceremony, something small and significant happened that received no coverage and involved no general and no ceremony. Brandon Kowalski drove to the Army recruitment office in the nearest city and spoke with a recruiter for an hour and a half. He was 23 years old. He was in good physical condition. He had been thinking since the morning of the ceremony at Fort Crestline about what it might mean to have a foundation under your feet that is made of something real. The kind of foundation that an 81-year-old man in a navy blazer has when he stands at a rope line and says all right and waits, because he knows what he is and knows it completely, independent of whether anyone around him knows it yet. He was not certain. He was thinking about it. That is how the important decisions begin for most people, not with certainty but with the inability to stop thinking about something, which is its own kind of answer presenting itself. Walter Creed drove home the day after the ceremony. 4 hours, same truck, same cracked dashboard, the same 2-lane roads he'd come in on. He stopped once for gas and coffee at a station outside of Millbrook, and stood at his truck in the parking lot for a few minutes, the coffee in his hand, looking at nothing in particular, which is the stance a man takes when he is processing something privately, giving it the room it needs. Then he got back in the truck. He had carried the 41 names for 60 years. He had carried them the way soldiers carry things, without display, without complaint, with the steady daily maintenance that things of great weight require. He had given his testimony from a hospital bed when he was too injured to stand because the record needed to be correct, and he was the only person who could make it so. He had driven 4 hours and been turned away from the rope line and stood there anyway, because that is what you do when the thing in front of you deserves your presence regardless of whether the people around you understand why you are there. The monument was built now. The names were in stone. A general had walked away from a receiving line to say what needed to be said without being asked. A young man who had made an error had stood in front of him and owned it, and received in return not the anger he perhaps expected, but something more useful. Instruction. The instruction of a man who has long since passed through anger into something more durable and more instructive. The patient conviction that attention is the beginning of respect, and that respect, applied correctly, changes what is possible in the people who receive it. Walter Creed pulled into his driveway at 4:30 in the afternoon, turned off the engine, and sat in the truck for a moment in the particular silence of a vehicle that has just stopped moving after a long distance. Then he got out. He walked to his front door with the deliberate gait of a man who's been sitting for 4 hours and is working the stiffness back out. He unlocked the door and went inside and put on the kettle for tea. Through the kitchen window, the late afternoon light was coming in at the angle that means the day is mostly done, but not entirely. Still some light left, enough to see by. He had been the last one for 60 years. He would be the last one for whatever time remained. This was not a tragedy to Walter Creed, though others sometimes received it as one when he told them. It was a responsibility. It was the thing his survival had assigned him, and he had been fulfilling it, in the quiet, accumulating way of a man who does not require an audience for 6 decades. The memorial was built. The names were in stone. His own name was not on the stone, and this was correct because he was not finished yet. He drank his tea at the kitchen table, in the house that had been his house for 40 years, and outside the light continued its slow departure, and he was still. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that the quiet, unassuming person standing next to you might be carrying something extraordinary, subscribe to this channel. We find the stories of the people who served without fanfare, who stood at the perimeter when they deserved the centre, and who changed the people around them not by demanding to be seen, but simply by being, fully and without apology, who they were. Those stories deserve to be told. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them.